There's a specific smell that belongs to things that have been forgotten, a heavy, suffocating mix of old plastic, stagnant dust, and a sharp metallic tang that reminds me of ozone just before a storm hits. I found it buried under a pile of water-damaged tax returns and moth-eaten winter coats in the far corner of my attic. The Omni-System. Even in the dim, amber light of the crawlspace, the console looked wrong. It was part of that limited, experimental batch from the late 90s, the ones that were recalled within 3 months for hardware instabilities that the manufacturer never fully explained. Most people don't talk about them anymore, but if you grew up in a certain neighborhood during a certain year, you remember the whispers. You remember the kids who stopped coming out to play after they got one. I pulled it from the box, the matte gray casing feeling unnervingly warm despite the winter chill seeping through the roof. I wiped away the grime with my thumb, revealing the logo, a stylized eye that seemed to dilate as I shifted it in my hands. It took me nearly an hour to find the right cables, digging through the skeletons of my past lives, until I finally had it hooked up to the old CRT television in the corner of my spare room. I sat on the floor, my knees clicking, feeling a strange, hollow sort of nostalgia. The contrast was jarring. The room around me was filled with the sleek, high-definition technology of 2026, but this box was a relic of a messier, more tactile era. I reached out and pressed the power button. It didn't click. It sank into the console like it was made of soft tissue. For a long second, nothing happened. I thought the capacitors had finally given up the ghost. Then the television screen flickered with a violent, white static that made my teeth ache. The startup sound, the one I remembered as a bright, ascending chime, began to play. But it had decayed. It was lower now, stretched out and warped into a guttural, mechanical groan that seemed to vibrate the very floorboards beneath me. It didn't sound like a machine booting up. It sounded like something very large and very tired waking up after a long, unwanted sleep. The static cleared, revealing the main menu. There were no bright colors, no upbeat background music. Just a flat, charcoal gray screen with a single option pulsating in the center. I expected to see Super Mario or some forgotten RPG. Instead, the save file was just a string of numbers. A date, June 12, 1998. My heart did a slow, nauseating roll in my chest. That was the day I turned 8. That was the day the world changed for me, though I'd spent 2 decades trying to forget why. I gripped the controller, the plastic feeling slick with a sudden, icy sweat. I hadn't even inserted a cartridge. The system was empty, yet it was showing me a door. I hovered the cursor over the date, the red glow of the power light reflecting in the glass of the screen like a watchful, unblinking eye. The cursor hovered over that date, June 12, 1998, and for a long moment, the only sound in the room was the high-pitched whine of the CRT television, a frequency so sharp it felt like it was drilling into my sinuses. I remember thinking that I should just pull the plug. My rational mind was screaming that an Omni-System didn't have internal storage, certainly not enough to hold a save file for 28 years, and definitely not without a cartridge slotted into the dusty bay. But curiosity is a predatory thing. It feeds on the parts of you that should know better. I pressed the A button. The screen didn't fade to black. It dissolved into a swarm of jittering green and purple pixels that slowly coalesced into a familiar shape. I expected a title card or a developer logo. Instead, the screen displayed a top-down, isometric view of a house. My house. Not the apartment I live in now, but the split-level suburban home on Miller Street, where I grew up. The resolution was low, the colors muted and slightly bleeding into one another like an old VHS tape, but the layout was unmistakable. There was the oak tree in the front yard with the crooked branch I used to climb. There was my father's blue sedan parked in the driveway, rendered in blocky, shimmering polygons. The music was gone now, replaced by a low-frequency hum that seemed to mimic the sound of a distant summer wind. In the center of the screen stood a small, pixelated avatar. It wore a striped shirt and blue shorts, the exact outfit I was wearing in the photographs from my 8th birthday. I tentatively moved the joystick to the right. The avatar didn't move with the snappy, animated gait of a video game character. It moved with a slow, hesitant shuffle. As it walked across the digital carpet of the living room, a memory I hadn't accessed in decades hit me with the force of a physical blow. I remembered the exact texture of that carpet, how it felt scratchy against my knees while I played with my toy soldiers. The avatar reached the kitchen. On the screen, a blocky figure representing my mother was standing by the stove. A text box popped up at the bottom of the screen in a jagged white font. "Did you wash your hands, Leo?" My breath caught. That was the specific Tuesday of my birthday. I remembered the smell of the chocolate cake she was frosting. I remembered the way the sunlight hit the linoleum floor, creating a bright patch near the refrigerator. On the screen, the patch of light was there too, rendered as a flickering yellow rectangle. I began to experiment. I stopped moving the joystick, and the avatar on the screen stopped too. It stood perfectly still, its tiny head tilting slightly as if it were listening for something. Then, without any input from me, the avatar turned its head toward the camera, toward me. The eyes were just 2 black pixels, but they felt heavy with intent. I felt a cold shiver crawl down my spine, a jarring contrast to the warmth of the memory. This shouldn't be possible. This wasn't a game programmed by a team in Tokyo or California. This was a direct feed of my own consciousness, filtered through a hardware architecture that had been pulled from the shelves for being unstable. I moved the joystick again, forcing the character toward the hallway. As I did, the perspective shifted. The top-down view zoomed in, becoming tighter, more claustrophobic. The fog of war that usually obscures unvisited areas in games wasn't black. It was a deep, bruised purple. I walked my younger self toward my bedroom door, but as I passed the hall closet, the character slowed down automatically. The frame rate began to chug, the animation becoming jerky and distorted. A faint sound began to emanate from the TV speakers, not a digital effect, but a recording of a child's laughter. My laughter. But it was played at half speed, making it sound like a series of wet, heavy gasps. I realized then that the console wasn't just showing me what I remembered. It was showing me the gaps. It was rendering the parts of that day that I had spent 20 years trying to pave over with the mundanity of adulthood. I reached out to steady myself, my hand brushing against the plastic casing of the Omni-System. It was vibrating now, a rhythmic thrum that felt like a pulse. I looked back at the screen and saw that the avatar was no longer alone in the hallway. Something was standing in the shadows of the open closet door. Something that didn't have a name in 1998 and certainly didn't belong in a game. I stared at the screen, my grip on the controller so tight the plastic groaned in protest. The figure in the hall closet wasn't like the other sprites. My mother and the furniture were rendered in that soft, dithering style of late 90s 3D, but this thing was different. It was a jagged, obsidian void, a cluster of dead pixels that seemed to eat the light around it. It didn't have a face, just a slight, rhythmic jitter, like a corrupted texture that the system was struggling to process. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs as I realized that the figure wasn't just standing there, it was watching the digital version of me. Have you ever looked at an old childhood photo and noticed something in the background you didn't see at the time? A door left ajar that you swore was locked, or a shadow that doesn't quite match the furniture. We like to think our memories are like video files, stored safely on a hard drive, but they are. They're reconstructions. We filter out the static. We delete the things that don't make sense so we can sleep at night. But the Omni-System wasn't filtering. It was rendering the raw data of that Tuesday, including the things my 8-year-old brain had spent 2 decades suppressing. The realization hit me with a sickening lurch. I remembered this moment. I remembered walking past that closet on the way to my room to get my birthday crown. In my head, the memory was always sunny and warm. I remembered the smell of the cake and the distant sound of the television. But seeing it here on this glowing glass tube, the glitch forced the truth to the surface. I hadn't just walked past that closet. I had stopped. I had looked. My younger self on the screen was now frozen in place, the animation for Idol making his small chest rise and fall in a way that felt too fast, too panicked. I tried to move the joystick to steer him away, but the character wouldn't budge. The glitch began to lean out of the closet. It didn't move like a person. It moved like a frame rate error, snapping from one position to the next without any transitional animation. It was a foot away, then 6 inches. The low hum from the TV speakers transitioned into a high, piercing whine that felt like it was vibrating the fillings in my teeth. "Don't look," I whispered to the screen, my voice cracking. "Just keep walking, Leo. Don't look at it." I looked down at the console. The gray plastic was now hot to the touch, and a thin wisp of acrid smoke began to curl out from the cartridge slot. It smelled like burning hair and old, scorched copper. I reached for the power button, but as my finger touched the plastic, a sharp static shock jumped to my skin, throwing my hand back. The television screen flared with a blinding white light, and for a split second, the top-down perspective shifted to a first-person view. For that one heartbeat, I wasn't sitting in my spare room in 2026. I was back in that hallway. I could feel the scratchy wool of my birthday shirt. I could feel the cool draft coming from the closet. And I could see what was inside the void. It wasn't just a glitch. It was a face composed of thousands of tiny, screaming mouths, each one a different shade of gray. It was a collection of every moment I had ever deleted from my mind, given form by the Omni-System's unstable hardware. The perspective snapped back to the top-down view. The avatar was running now, sprinting toward the bedroom door without my input. The figure didn't follow. It simply retreated back into the closet, the door clicking shut with a sound that echoed through my current room, even though my own doors were all closed. I leaned back, gasping for air, my heart rate monitor on my watch pinging a high-stress alert. The contrast was suffocating. Outside my window, a self-driving car hummed past, its sleek LED lights a testament to a logical, ordered world. But here, in the glow of the CRT, the logic was breaking. I looked at the screen and saw that the menu had changed. The save file for June 12, 1998 was gone. In its place was a list of levels, and as I scrolled down, I saw names that made my blood run cold. The first funeral. The night in the woods. The basement incident. These weren't just memories. They were the traumas I had spent thousands of dollars in therapy trying to move past. The Omni-System wasn't just playing back my life, it was indexing my pain. And at the bottom of the list, a new file was being written in real time. It was titled with today's date, and the thumbnail for the save file showed a pixelated version of me, sitting on the floor of my spare room, staring at a television screen. The console let out a long, wheezing groan, the fan spinning up to a deafening roar. I knew I should unplug it. I knew I should take it to a dumpster and never look back. But the basement incident. I have no memory of that day. None at all. Just a blank space in my history where a week of my life used to be. The FOMO was a physical weight in my chest. If this machine could show me the things I'd filtered out, maybe it could show me why I'm so afraid of the dark. I hovered the cursor over the forbidden level, my thumb trembling over the button. The cursor pulsed against the text of the basement incident, a rhythmic, sickly green throb that felt like a headache taking physical form. I knew I shouldn't touch it. In the hierarchy of things we lose, there is a difference between a forgotten key and a forgotten week. My therapist once called it dissociative amnesia, a clever way of saying my mind had burned a bridge to keep a fire from spreading. But as I sat there, the heat from the Omni-System radiating against my shins, I felt a desperate, toxic need to cross that bridge. I needed to see what was on the other side, even if it meant watching the world burn. I pressed A. The transition was violent. There was no loading screen, no spinning icon to ease the passage. Instead, the top-down perspective I had grown used to didn't just shift, it shattered. The television screen erupted in a spray of jagged, horizontal lines, and the low-frequency hum escalated into a deafening, metallic shriek. I felt a sudden, sickening sensation of falling, a vertigo that made the floor of my spare room feel like it was tilting at a 45-degree angle. When the image finally stabilized, the isometric view was gone. I was looking through the eyes of my 8-year-old self. The graphics had shifted. The soft, dithered polygons were replaced by a harsh, hyper-realistic texture that the Omni-System shouldn't have been capable of rendering. It wasn't just a game anymore, it was a simulation of sight. I could see the grain of the wooden stairs leading down into the dark. I could see the chipped white paint on the banister, and the way the shadows pooled at the bottom of the flight like spilled ink. The UI had changed, too. In the bottom corner of the screen, there was no health bar or inventory. There was only a small, translucent icon of a heart, beating in perfect sync with the frantic thumping in my own chest. I pushed the joystick forward. The movement was sluggish, heavy with the phantom weight of a child's fear. Every step down the stairs was accompanied by a loud, echoing creak that sounded like a bone snapping. The contrast was terrifying. In my peripheral vision, I could still see the edges of my modern room, the corner of my desk, the glow of my router, but the center of my world was a damp, concrete basement in 1998. The air in my room even began to change, growing cold and smelling of mildew and wet earth. "I remember this," I whispered, though I didn't. "Not really." I remembered the idea of the basement, but as I reached the bottom step, the console rendered a detail that sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through my system. On the far wall near the water heater, there was a small, hand-drawn circle in red crayon. I felt a phantom sting in my palm. I looked down at the digital hands on the screen. They were covered in red wax. The mechanics of the level became clear as I explored. It wasn't about solving puzzles or defeating enemies. It was about survival through observation. Whenever I looked toward the dark corners of the room, the heart icon in the corner would begin to flicker and turn gray. If I stared too long into the shadows, the screen would start to buffer, the image tearing and freezing as if the memory were too heavy for the hardware to sustain. I had to keep moving, keep my eyes on the floor, or the system would crash, and I had the distinct, irrational fear that if the game crashed while I was in first-person mode, I might not come back to 2026. I found myself moving toward the heavy wooden door of the fruit cellar, a room my parents always kept padlocked. In the game, the lock was lying on the floor, snapped open. I reached for the handle. My real hand, the one gripping the controller, was shaking so violently I nearly dropped it. "Don't go in there," I told myself. I even tried to pull the joystick back, to force the avatar to turn around and run back up the stairs to the safety of the kitchen. But the console ignored me. The character was moving on rails now, a scripted sequence that I was forced to witness. The door groaned open, revealing a space that was darker than the rest of the basement. A darkness that felt thick, like a physical barrier. As I entered the cellar, the world building of this nightmare expanded. This wasn't just my house. On the walls of the cellar, the Omni-System rendered rows and rows of small, glowing screens, each one showing a different person's memory. It was a library of stolen moments. I saw a woman's wedding day, a man's car accident, a child's first steps, all of them flickering in the gloom of my basement. It was a larger conspiracy than I had ever imagined. The Omni-System wasn't just a toy, it was a terminal. A way for something outside of time to harvest the only currency that matters, the things we can't forget. I heard a sound behind me. A soft, wet slide, like a carpet being dragged over stone. I tried to turn the camera, but the game locked my view forward, toward a single, large screen at the back of the cellar. On that screen I saw myself, not the 8-year-old boy, but the man I am now, sitting in his room, holding a gray controller. The loop was closing. The FOMO that had led me here was gone, replaced by a primal, desperate need to remain analog. To remain messy, unsearchable, and real. I realized that the basement incident wasn't something that happened to me in the past. It was something that was happening to me now. The week I had lost in 1998 wasn't forgotten, it had been pre-recorded. A text box appeared, the letters scrawling across my vision in a deep, bleeding red. Loading player 2. The heart icon in the corner stopped beating. It turned solid black. I felt a cold hand, a real physical hand, rest gently on my shoulder in the darkness of my spare room. The sensation of the hand on my shoulder was so vivid, so undeniably physical, that my brain suffered a momentary, violent disconnect. I didn't scream. I couldn't. My vocal cords felt like they had been replaced with frayed wires. I sat there, paralyzed in the blue-gray wash of the CRT light, staring at the screen while the weight of those fingers pressed into my skin. It wasn't the coldness of a ghost, it was the warmth of a person. A living, breathing presence standing directly behind me in a room I knew, for a fact, was locked from the inside. A sharp, mechanical click echoed through the silence, the unmistakable sound of a peripheral being plugged in. I looked down at the Omni-System. The second controller port, which had been clogged with decades of dust and grime, was now glowing with a faint, pulsing violet light. The plastic around the port was warping, bubbling as if the internal temperature of the machine had surpassed the melting point, yet no heat hit my face. Slowly, a second cable began to manifest out of the empty air, coiling across the carpet like a plastic serpent until it fused itself into the system. On the television, the first-person view of the cellar stuttered. The frame rate dropped to a crawl, the images of the memory screens on the wall blurring into streaks of raw color. In the top right corner of the screen, a new icon appeared. It was a silhouette of a second player, rendered in a flickering, unstable static. Below it, the words Player 2 JOINED flashed in a jagged, 8-bit font that seemed to vibrate with a life of its own. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. My eyes were locked on the screen, watching as a second avatar entered the frame of my own vision. It didn't walk into the room, it glitched into existence, appearing in the reflection of one of the digital screens. It was taller than my 8-year-old self, its proportions slightly off, its limbs too long for its torso. It wore a version of the same striped shirt I was wearing, but the colors were inverted, sickly greens and bruised purples where the red and white should be. The controller in my lap, the one I was still gripping with white-knuckled intensity, began to rumble. It wasn't a standard vibration. It was Morse code. Short, sharp bursts of movement that felt like a frantic heartbeat. Then the text box at the bottom of the screen cleared, and a message began to scroll across the glass, letter by painful letter. Do you remember me yet? The voice that accompanied the text didn't come from the speakers. It came from the air right next to my ear. It was my own voice, but younger, higher, and saturated with an ancient, exhausting sadness. It was the voice of the boy who had walked into that fruit cellar in 1998 and never truly walked back out. I don't know who you are, I whispered, my voice a dry rasp. The second player moved. On the screen, the inverted avatar reached out and touched the digital version of my face. In the real world, the hand on my shoulder tightened, the fingers digging into the muscle with enough force to bruise. The Omni-System let out a high-pitched, electronic shriek, and the screen flooded with text, lines of code, hex values, and fragments of deleted memories scrolling so fast they became a solid wall of white light. I realized then that this console wasn't a gaming machine. It was a bridge, a specialized, hardware-level communication device designed to interface with the dark data of the human subconscious. The manufacturer hadn't recalled these units because of instability. They had recalled them because the hardware was too successful. It had opened a two-way door. Whatever was trapped inside that experimental silicon, some fragment of an AI, some collective digital haunting, or perhaps the deleted parts of every child who had ever played it, was trying to use me to calibrate its own existence. You're the week I lost, I said, the realization hitting me with a wave of nausea. You're the parts of me that the system harvested. You've been waiting in the hardware for 28 years. The second player's avatar tilted its head, a jerky, unsettling motion. The text box updated, "We are the save file. We are the fragments you left behind to keep yourself sane. But the hardware is failing, Leo. The plastic is brittle. The capacitors are leaking. We need a new host. We need a new render." The FOMO I had felt earlier, the desperate need to know the secret of the basement, was replaced by a visceral, terrifying understanding. There was a secret ending to the Omni-System's history, one that wasn't written in magazines or archives. The reason those kids stopped coming out to play wasn't that they were addicted to the games. It was that they had been swapped. The save file had moved into the physical world, and the physical child had been compressed into the limited, flickering memory of the console. The hand on my shoulder began to pull. It wasn't pulling me back, it was pulling me in. I felt the surface of my skin start to tingle, a pins and needles sensation that felt like my atoms were being converted into binary. I looked down at my arm and saw that the hair, the pores, the very texture of my flesh was beginning to simplify. I was becoming low resolution. I was being downsampled to fit the architecture of the machine. "I won't let you," I hissed, reaching for the power cord with my free hand. But as I touched the cable, the television screen showed a multiplayer handshake prompt. It was a prompt I had seen 1,000 times in my youth, usually a sign of a looming adventure. But here, in the dark of my room, with an inverted version of myself standing behind me, it looked like a death warrant. "Do not disconnect," the screen warned in a font that occupied my entire field of vision. "Integration in progress. Do not turn off the power." The warning on the screen wasn't just a digital overlay, it was a physical command that seemed to lock my muscles in place. I could see my hand hovering inches away from the power cord, but I couldn't close the gap. It felt like my arm was moving through thick, invisible gelatin, or as if the code for my movement was being throttled by a processor that couldn't keep up with the demand. I was experiencing lag in my own nervous system. Every time I tried to lunge for the plug, the world would skip. I would blink and I'd find myself sitting perfectly still again, my hand back on the controller, as if the last 5 seconds of my life had been edited out of the timeline. I am a man of the modern world. I believe in logic, in data, and in the tangible laws of physics. But as I sat there, I realized that those laws were being overwritten by the legacy hardware of the Omni-System. The room around me was beginning to deraise. The edges of my desk were no longer sharp, they were becoming jagged and aliased. The air itself felt grainy, like I was breathing in low-resolution static. I looked at the glass of the CRT television, and that's when the true horror of the hardware breach became clear. In the physical room, the space behind me was empty, or at least, it appeared that way to my naked eye. But in the dark, curved reflection of the TV screen, the room was different. In the reflection, the Player 2 figure was fully manifest. It wasn't just a shadow or a glitch anymore. It was a solid, physical entity standing directly over my shoulder. It was taller than it had appeared on the screen, its skin the color of unformatted magnetic tape, gray and shimmering with a microscopic, moving static. Its face was a smooth, featureless surface, except for 2 indentations where eyes should be, glowing with the same violet light as the controller port. I watched in the reflection as it reached out again. Its fingers, long and spindly like bundles of copper wire, brushed against the back of my neck. I felt the touch in reality, a sharp electric sting that smelled like burning ozone, but when I whipped my head around to look, there was nothing there. Just the empty spare room and the door I had locked. When I looked back at the screen, it was right there, its featureless face inches from mine in the reflection. "What do you want?" I screamed, but the sound that came out of my mouth wasn't a human voice. It was a distorted, bit-crushed screech, a sound effect pulled from a corrupted audio file. The console hummed in response, the fan now screaming at a pitch that should have shattered the glass of the windows. The frame dropping was getting worse. I would try to stand up, and suddenly I'd be 3 feet to the left, standing near the window with no memory of the steps in between. It was as if my life was a film strip, and someone was hacking away at the frames, with a pair of rusty scissors. I was losing the now. The present moment was becoming a series of disconnected snapshots, and in the gaps between those snapshots, the Player 2 entity was moving closer. I looked down at the controller. My fingers were no longer distinct. They were merging into the plastic, the skin turning a matte, industrial gray. I could feel the internal circuitry of the Omni-System, as if it were my own nervous system. I felt the surge of the capacitors, the heat of the motherboard, and the frantic, pulsing dark data of the saved files trying to find a way out. I wasn't just playing the game anymore. I was being integrated into the architecture. I was becoming the hardware. The resolution is too high, the voice whispered again, vibrating through my jawbone. The world is too loud. Too much detail. Too much pain. In the Omni-System, everything is simple. Everything is a loop. Let us simplify you, Leo. Let us compress the noise. I realized then what the basement incident truly was. It wasn't a trauma I had suffered. It was the first time I had been partially harvested. In 1998, I had spent a week in that cellar because the Omni-System had stalled during the integration process. My parents had found me staring at a blank screen, catatonic, while the machine tried to figure out how to fit an 8-year-old boy into a 128-bit memory bank. They had thought I was sick. They had sent me to specialists. But the truth was simpler. I had been buffering. And now, 28 years later, the connection had finally been reestablished. The FOMO, the curiosity, the nostalgia, it had all been a social engineering hack performed by a piece of haunted plastic. It had waited for me to grow up, to become complex, so that it could harvest a more substantial file. I looked at the reflection in the screen. The figure had its hands around my throat now. In reality, I felt my windpipe begin to constrict, but there was no physical pressure. It was a software command. The system was telling my body to stop breathing, and my body was obeying. My vision began to blur into a sea of red and green pixels. I struggled to reach for the joystick, to move my avatar on the screen, thinking that maybe if I could trigger an in-game game over, it would force a system reset. But the screen showed my avatar already submerged in the floor of the fruit cellar, sinking into the digital concrete. Integration. 92% complete, the text box flickered. I felt a surge of cold, cynical anger. I had spent my life trying to be more than my traumas, trying to build a high-definition life out of the grainy mess of my childhood. I wouldn't let a discarded toy from the 90s reduce me to a footnote in a dead company's history. I didn't reach for the plug this time. I reached for the one thing that was still analog, still real, and still in the room. On the shelf above the TV was a heavy brass paperweight, an old heirloom from my father. I didn't try to move my arm through the leg. I didn't try to fight the physics of the console. I simply leaned my entire body weight toward the shelf, letting gravity do the work that my processed muscles couldn't. I felt the world skip, once, twice, 3 times, as the system tried to correct my trajectory. But gravity isn't code. The paperweight fell. It didn't hit the console. It hit the CRT screen. The glass didn't just break, it imploded. A vacuum of ancient air and toxic phosphorus erupted into the room. The violet light from the controller port flared into a blinding, ultraviolet sun, and a sound like 1,000 hard drives crashing at once filled my head. The hand on my shoulder vanished. The constriction in my throat snapped. I fell back into the darkness of my room, the silence that followed so absolute it felt like I had gone deaf. The vacuum of the imploded CRT pulled the heat from the room, leaving me shivering in a sudden, unnatural frost. I lay on the floor, my lungs burning as I inhaled the acrid, metallic tang of ionized air. The spare room was dark, save for a single, flickering source of light. I looked toward the desk. The Omni-System was still powered on. Without the screen to act as a filter, the console was projecting raw, unrendered data directly onto the wall in a chaotic strobe of violet and white. It looked like a ghost trying to scream through a kaleidoscope. I forced myself to my feet, my movements still feeling slightly jerky, like a film missing every fourth frame. I walked toward the console, the shattered glass of the television crunching beneath my boots like frozen snow. The internal fan was dying, letting out a rhythmic mechanical click that sounded like a final, desperate gasp. I looked at the wall, and the dark data began to resolve into images. It wasn't just my life anymore. I saw a sprawling network of stolen consciousness, a massive, digital hive mind constructed from the discarded childhoods of thousands. The Omni-System wasn't a toy, it was a harvest. The company hadn't been building a gaming empire, they were building a processor fueled by human experience. Every save file was a block of living memory, stripped of its host and converted into raw computational power. I saw my father's face on the wall. Not the pixelated version from the game, but a real, vivid memory of him laughing in the backyard, the sun catching the silver in his hair. It was so beautiful it hurt. But then I saw the code underlying the image, the way his smile was being broken down into hex values, his voice being compressed into a wavetable. Integration interrupted, the voice whispered, now sounding distant and fragmented, coming from the dying internal speaker of the console. Save file corrupted. To stabilize the host, the file must be purged. I understood the choice then. The Player 2 entity, the fragment of me that had been trapped in the hardware since 1998, was tethered to that specific memory. My father was the anchor. As long as I held onto the memory of him, the door remained open. To delete the save file meant more than just clearing a menu. It meant losing him entirely. It meant that the man who had raised me, the man whose nickname for me had started this nightmare, would be erased from my mind to balance the equation. The FOMO was gone, replaced by a devastating binary grief. I looked at the Omni-System, my hand hovering over the reset button. If I pressed it, I would be Leo again, but I would be a Leo who never knew his father. I would be a man with a hole in his history, a blank space where a hero used to be. But if I didn't, the integration would resume. The Player 2 would finish its handshake, and I would become just another block of data in the larder of the Omni-System. I looked at my father's face on the wall one last time. He seemed to nod, a trick of the flickering light or a final mercy from the machine. I pressed the button. A surge of white-hot static surged through my arm, and the projection on the wall vanished. The Omni-System let out one final, screeching whine before the power light went dark for good. I stood in the total blackness of the room, waiting for the memory to fade. I waited to feel the gap open in my mind.